Have you ever looked at Mars and wondered why that cold red dot has haunted the human mind for thousands of years? What if one of the strangest ancient books on Earth was not just telling a spiritual story, but preserving a memory that sounds disturbingly like a dead world in the sky? If this kind of mystery pulls you in, hit like so more seekers can find this video. Subscribe for deep stories that stay with you after the screen goes dark. And share this with one friend who loves questions bigger than easy answers. For most people, Mars is simple. It is the red planet, a dry world, a frozen desert. But Mars has never felt simple to the human imagination. It glows unlike the other wandering lights. It looks wounded. Even before telescopes, people saw that color and gave it meaning. War, fire, omen, blood, judgment. Something about Mars has always felt less like scenery and more like a warning. Now, place that feeling next to one of the most controversial ancient texts ever preserved, the Book of Enoch. Enoch, a text loved by some early believers, rejected by many religious authorities, copied across centuries and wrapped in mystery almost from the moment people started arguing about what belonged in sacred history and what did not. It is a book filled with visions, watchers, heavenly journeys, strange punishments, and a universe that feels far larger and far more dangerous than the neat world many people imagine when they think of ancient religion. And that is where the tension begins. Because once you put Mars and Enoch in the same sentence, the internet does what the internet always does. Claims start flying. Hidden chapters, suppressed verses, forbidden knowledge, ancient descriptions of a ruined planet, lost civilizations, beings that came here before recorded history knew what to call them. Suddenly, the question is no longer just what Mars is. That question matters, because the real power of this story is not in careless hype. It is in the collision between two human instincts that never stop fighting each other. One instinct wants wonder. The other wants proof. One sees symbolism everywhere. The other demands evidence line by line. And right in the middle stands a strange old book and a red planet that still refuses to feel ordinary. So let us slow this down and make it clear. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish work made up of several sections written over time. It expands on brief ideas from Genesis, especially the mysterious story of the Watchers. The beings who descend cross boundaries they were not meant to cross, and bring corruption into the human story. Enoch itself is not part of most modern biblical canons, though it remains especially important in the Ethiopian tradition and hugely important for understanding how many ancient people imagined heaven, judgment, rebellion, and the unseen structure of reality. That alone makes it fascinating, but it also makes it easy to misuse. People hear that Enoch is ancient, mysterious, and excluded by many traditions, and they instantly assume it must contain secret information too explosive for normal people to see. But the reason Enoch survived in people's memory is not because it reads like science fiction. It survived because it feels morally dangerous and spiritually vast. It describes a universe where actions have cosmic consequences, where rebellion changes worlds, where judgment is not abstract, it is structural. It alters the conditions of life itself. And that idea, more than any one dramatic claim, is what keeps linking Enoch to Mars. When modern people look at Mars, they do not just see geology. They see aftermath. They see river channels with no rivers, polar ice, dust storms, canyons so large they make Earth look modest. Evidence that long ago, Mars was not the place it is now. It once had flowing water. It once had a thicker atmosphere. It once had conditions that, at least for a time, were far more friendly to life than the frozen desert we see today. That is exactly the kind of pattern the human mind cannot leave alone. A world that lost its water. A world stripped down over unimaginable time. A world that seems to whisper that it used to be more alive than it is now. Put that beside an ancient text obsessed with rebellion, consequence, descent, corruption, and judgment, and you can see why people begin connecting dots, even when the dots do not cleanly connect. But here is where things get more interesting, not less. The most powerful version of this theory does not come from what Enoch clearly says. It comes from the emotional shape of what Enoch says. The book repeatedly presents creation as layered, ordered, and vulnerable to moral rupture. reality and invisible decisions are tightly connected. That framework makes some readers ask a dramatic question. If judgment in Enoch can reshape the condition of a world, could ancient readers have looked at Mars and imagined they were looking at the remains of one? That is not the same as saying Enoch literally describes Mars by name. It is asking why Mars fits the emotional grammar of Enoch so well. Think about the imagery. A red world hanging in the sky, a text full of watchers, falls, boundaries broken, and punishments that scar creation. A modern planet that appears ancient, wounded, and silent. The connection is almost poetic before it is ever historical. And sometimes poetry is what opens the door that speculation later rushes through. Still, the case people make is usually stronger than poetry. They point to the way Mars changed over time. Scientists believe early Mars had liquid water on its surface. They believe it once had a much thicker atmosphere. They believe the loss of its magnetic protection played a major role in letting solar winds strip that atmosphere away over vast stretches of time. In simple terms, Mars may once have had the shield needed to remain warmer and wetter, then gradually lost it. If you wanted to tell that story in ancient symbolic language, you might not describe plasma, atmospheric escape, and magnetism. You might describe a covering removed, a shelter taken away, a world exposed. And once that language enters the room, Enoch-like thinking starts to feel eerily close. Not scientifically close, narratively close. That difference matters, because there is a huge gap between saying, this ancient worldview has symbols that resemble how we might emotionally interpret a ruined planet, and saying, this book contains a literal ancient report about Mars and the beings who lived there. One of those ideas is thoughtful. The other needs evidence it does not currently have. That said, we should not dismiss the emotional force of the question too quickly. Human beings do not cling to stories like this only because they are gullible. We cling to them because they speak to something deep inside us. We want the universe to remember. We want ruins to mean more than erosion. We want ancient texts to contain more than ritual and law. We want to believe that when our ancestors looked up, they were not just inventing myths. They were catching fragments of a truth too large to explain. And Mars is the perfect screen for that longing. It is close enough to study, far enough to remain mysterious, familiar enough to imagine, and dead enough to project upon. Mars feels like a mirror held at a tragic angle. Not quite Earth, but Earth enough to hurt. It invites a haunting possibility. If a world can begin with promise and end in silence, what does that say about worlds in general? What does that say about us? That is where Enoch suddenly stops feeling like a curiosity and starts feeling personal. Because the Book of Enoch is not really obsessed with astronomy for its own sake. It is obsessed with order and disorder, with the price of transgression, with the tragedy that follows when power breaks trust. Whether you read it religiously, historically, or symbolically, its central warning is clear. Some boundaries exist for a reason. When they are crossed, the damage spreads outward. Now imagine an audience hearing that message while looking up at a red planet every night. Even if they knew nothing about Martian geology, they knew how to read a sign. They knew how to assign moral meaning to the sky. They knew how to turn visible objects into spiritual reminders. For them, the heavens were not empty. They were legible. In that kind of world, Mars would never be just a planet. It would be an image waiting for interpretation. So when modern storytellers say Enoch describes what Mars actually is, what they are really doing is compressing several different ideas into one dramatic sentence. First, Mars looks judged. Second, Enoch thinks in terms of judged worlds, fallen beings, and cosmic consequence. Third, human beings are wired to bridge those ideas into story. The problem is that once those ideas are compressed, the audience often forgets the difference between resemblance and evidence. And that is exactly where careful thinking becomes exciting. Because the truth does not get weaker when we remove exaggeration. In some ways, it gets stronger. The genuine mystery is not that Enoch gives us a secret NASA briefing from antiquity. The genuine mystery is that ancient minds, using symbols and theology rather than science, often produce images that still feel uncannily capable of framing what we see in the universe. They were wrong about many mechanisms. Of course they were. But they were not shallow. They were staring at reality with moral seriousness. They believed the structure of the cosmos meant something. If you are still with me, tap like, subscribe if you want stories that respect your intelligence, and send this video to the one person you know who loves ancient texts, strange planets, and questions that get more unsettling the longer you sit with them. Now let us go deeper into the part that really grips people, the idea that something may once have lived on Mars. Scientifically, that remains an open question. There is no confirmed evidence of ancient Martian cities, advanced Martian beings, or survivors who somehow came to Earth. None. That line should be bright and non-negotiable. But the possibility that microbial life may once have existed on Mars is taken seriously because ancient Mars appears to have had conditions that could, at least in principle, support life. Water matters. Chemistry matters. Stability matters. Mars once had more of those ingredients than it has now. And this is where the imagination jumps. If simple life was possible, people ask, why stop at simple life? If a world once had rivers, lakes, weather, and a thicker atmosphere, why assume it never held something more? That leap is emotionally understandable, but it is still a leap. The distance between microbes and civilizations is enormous. Yet stories rarely care about that distance. Stories move straight toward significance. They ask not what is most likely first, but what is most dramatic if true. That is why the Mars-Enoch connection keeps spreading. It takes an unresolved scientific question, joins it to an ancient text already surrounded by mystery, and then adds the oldest fuel on Earth, the suspicion that official stories never tell us everything. There is power in that formula because institutions do sometimes fail. Authorities do dismiss too quickly. Gatekeepers do shape what gets discussed and what gets ignored. That part is real. But once a story starts feeding on distrust alone, it can become almost impossible to test. Every missing piece becomes proof of suppression. Every objection becomes evidence of fear. Every gap becomes a doorway for fantasy. So, how do we stay honest without losing wonder? By asking better questions. Not, did Enoch literally reveal an ancient Martian civilization? Because right now, we do not have the evidence to say that. Ask instead, why does Mars so naturally fit the symbolic world of Enoch? Ask, why do judged world images feel so convincing when we look at a ruined planet? Ask, what does our attraction to this theory reveal about our fears, our hopes, and our hunger for cosmic meaning? And then ask the most important question of all. What if the power of this idea is not that Enoch explains Mars, but that Mars reactivates Enoch? What if the red planet forces modern people to feel, in scientific language, something ancient people felt in symbolic language? That worlds can change. That protection can be lost. That life is more fragile than it looks. That silence may come after abundance. That the sky is not merely beautiful, it is sobering. Seen that way, Mars becomes more than an object of speculation. It becomes a warning across time. Not because a hidden chapter says so, because reality says so. Mars shows us that a planet can move from potentially habitable to brutally exposed. It shows us that environments are not guaranteed forever. It shows us that conditions which support life can collapse or erode. And Enoch, in its own completely different language, keeps pressing the same moral pressure point. Do not assume order is permanent simply because it is familiar. That is why this topic hits people so hard. It is really about loss. Loss of a world. Loss of protection. Loss of innocence. Loss of certainty. Loss of the comforting belief that if something is here now, it must always remain here. Even the darker parts of Enoch follow that rhythm. Boundaries are crossed. Corruption spreads. Consequences arrive. After that, nothing is quite what it was before. Whether you treat that as theology, myth, symbolic psychology, or cultural memory, it speaks to a truth people recognize instantly. Damage can become structural. Some choices change the environment itself. And if you want to understand why people insert Mars into that structure, just imagine standing under the night sky in the ancient world. No city glow, no phones, no satellites. Just darkness, stars, and that red object moving with slow intention over the seasons. You would not see a sterile astronomy fact. You would see a sign asking to be interpreted. Humans have always answered that invitation. But here is the turn most people miss. Maybe the deepest reason the Book of Enoch and Mars belong in the same conversation is not because the book secretly mapped the planet. Maybe it is because both force us to confront scale. Enoch expands moral scale. Mars expands physical scale. Enoch says the consequences of rebellion can exceed human comfort. Mars says the universe does not owe life permanence. Put those together, and you get a vision both terrifying and strangely clarifying. We are not the center by default. We are not immune by default. And we are not wise simply because we are modern. That last part matters more than it seems. Ancient people often filled gaps in knowledge with myth. Modern people often fill gaps in meaning with data. But data alone cannot satisfy the human need to ask what anything finally means. You can explain Martian dust, atmospheric stripping, and ancient water loss in technical detail and still not answer why a dead world feels tragic when we look at it. That is not a scientific question, it is a human one. And Enoch lives in human questions. It lives in the fear that unseen things shape visible outcomes. It lives in the intuition that corruption is contagious. It lives in the sense that judgment is not always thunder from the sky. Sometimes it is the slow removal of what once made flourishing possible. When people read Mars through that lens, they're not just chasing shock value. They are trying to make cosmic reality emotionally legible. Sometimes they go too far, but the impulse itself is ancient. This is why dismissing every Mars and Enoch conversation as nonsense is too easy. Some versions are careless, yes. Some are built on invented quotations, weak translations, or dramatic claims that collapse on inspection. But beneath the mess, it's a serious human effort to connect text, sky, ruin, and meaning. That effort deserves criticism when it overreaches, but it also deserves understanding. Because over and over, across cultures and centuries, we do the same thing. We look at the heavens and ask what kind of story we are living inside. And maybe that is the real heartbeat of this entire mystery. Not whether Enoch proves Mars once held giants. Not whether hidden manuscripts confirm visitors from a red world. Not whether every rumor about suppression is true. It is geology, yes. It is physics, yes. But it also feels like a monument. A monument with no inscription we can fully read. And that unreadability is exactly what keeps us coming back. If this mystery is hitting you harder now than it did at the start, subscribe before you forget. Leave a like if you want more scripts that go beyond easy claims. And share this with someone who enjoys ideas that live somewhere between history, science, and the edge of the unknown. So where does that leave us here? I think in the most honest place. The Book of Enoch does not give us solid proof that Mars was once home to an advanced race that later came to Earth. The evidence for that claim is not there. But Enoch does give us a language of cosmic consequence, lost order, and judged reality that fits uncannily well with the emotional image Mars creates in the modern mind. And Mars does give us a real example of a world that changed so deeply that it now feels like the memory of life rather than life itself. That combination is enough to unsettle anyone who is paying attention. Because once you see Mars that way, it stops being just a target for exploration. It becomes a question aimed back at us. What protects a world? What causes a world to lose that protection? How much can disappear before only traces remain? And if intelligence ever did rise elsewhere, what would be left after enough time, enough erosion, enough silence? Stone, maybe. Patterns, maybe. Or perhaps nothing obvious at all. Just an emptiness that refuses to explain itself. That may sound disappointing if you came looking for certainty, but uncertainty is not emptiness. Sometimes uncertainty is the deepest kind of invitation. It forces us to keep reading carefully, keep observing honestly, and keep resisting the lazy comfort of answers that arrive too fast. That is why this story matters. It teaches restraint without killing wonder. It teaches curiosity without surrendering to every rumor. It teaches us that a text can be spiritually powerful without becoming a codebook for every modern mystery. And it teaches us that a planet can be scientifically knowable and still feel symbolically overwhelming. In the end, maybe Mars and Enoch meet in one place above all others. Both remind us that reality is bigger than the categories we try to lock it into. Ancient or modern, science or scripture, symbol or stone. We keep drawing lines because the unknown makes us nervous. But the most unforgettable ideas are the ones that stand right on those lines and dare us to look longer. So the next time Mars rises above the horizon, do not just see a red planet, see a question. See the memory of water. See the possibility of lost habitability. See the human instinct to read meaning into ruin. See why a book like Enoch still grips people after so many centuries. And then ask yourself something harder than whether the theory is true. Ask why it feels so powerful even before it is proven, because that is where the real story begins. It begins in the part of us that knows facts matter, but also knows facts alone do not silence awe. It begins in the tension between evidence and meaning. It begins in the quiet realization that when we stare at a dead-looking world, we are never only studying that world. We are also measuring our own fragility against it. Maybe that is why Mars has always looked red to us in more ways than one. Not just like rust, like memory, like warning, like the aftermath of something we were never there to witness, but somehow still feel. And maybe that is why the Book of Enoch still refuses to stay buried, not because it answers every mystery, but because it keeps teaching us how to stand inside one.